Who are you?
I'm Nardwar.
No, you are Lars?
From Rancid.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and in my personal opinion, Rancid may be the single most underrated punk band of all time. Because although everyone obviously knows who they are, I don't hear their name come up as often as it probably should. Because other than maybe Green Day, I can't think of a band that did more to get real, legitimate DIY punk rock onto radio and MTV and into millions of households all over the world and expose a whole generation of people to the culture. They proved that ska punk didn't have to be corny kids from Orange County, adding a horn section to basic pop punk songs, and sold millions and millions of albums without ever compromising on the sound and values of punk. Something that I really don't think any other band has done before or since. But as is always the case with any band that comes along like that, they also got a ton of backlash from the punk elite who didn't want anyone else coming into the scene and didn't like seeing punk on MTV or used in the background of shampoo commercials. So the question is, how do they do it? How did Rancid go from being a scrappy little Gilman band to all over MTV? How bad was the backlash? And most importantly, what is their lasting impact and legacy? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. And when you're done defending pop punk, you can defend your tower with today's sponsor, Rush Royale. It's a deck building tower defense game where you build a deck full of powerful units like archers, trappers, and blade dancers, and then merge them to create even stronger units. But that is not all, my friends. For a limited time only, you can recruit the one and only Jake Paul as your hero to knock out your enemies just like he knocks fools out in the ring. And Jake Paul's character in the game has some very cool, unique abilities like the Super Punch, Hype, Energy Boost, RR, Memory Photo, and a Champion's Belt. And this character is a limited time edition that will only be available until July 29th. So if you want to check it out, install Rush Royale for free using my link in the description of this video, or scan the QR code on the screen right now and get a special master chest bonus with gold, a set of cards, and magic dust, which can be exchanged for a legendary card. And if you're using an iOS device, don't forget to allow tracking on the first launch of the game to get the chest. And hurry up, because the number of rewards is limited.
I know the move from cavemen over and over again. Beat up crews, a record is broken. Tina's crying again.
But to answer all those questions, I need to start at the very beginning and explain where Rancid came from. The story starts with a band called Operation Ivy from Berkeley, California, which had Tim Armstrong and Matt Freeman on guitar and bass respectively. And Operation Ivy was only active for a few years from 1987 to 1989, but in that short period of time, they made a huge impact on the scene. I personally heard them in 1991 when a friend of mine from school played them for me, and I was instantly hooked. I had never heard anything like it, and I didn't know what ska was. So I was just like, what is this? Is this like punk reggae? I didn't know what to call it, but the songs were just undeniable. They were so energetic and fun, so catchy, and the band started to get noticed right away. They quickly signed to Lookout Records, the future home of bands like Green Day and Screeching Weasel, and almost immediately became one of the label's biggest selling bands. And on the back of that success, they were offered a major label contract, which they turned down. And right as it looked like Operation Ivy was about to be catapulted to success, they broke up. I don't know if this is true or not, but the story at the time was that they couldn't handle the pressures of success and they didn't want to sell out. And so rather than take that route, they just broke up. Again, I'm not sure how accurate that was, but either way, they broke up shortly before the release of their first and only album, Energy, which to this day, I still think is one of the single best punk albums ever recorded. And that album, along with probably the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, basically kicked off the entire ska punk scene of the 90s. And with that album being as great as it was, and the band having so much success so quickly, you kind of had to wonder, what if they didn't break up? How far could Operation Ivy have gone if they did take that major label deal? Could they have been Green Day before Green Day?
This song was sung by a band called Operation Ivy.
And the reason I mention all of this is because I think in order to understand Rancid, you have to have all this background. In particular, the values and culture that they came from. The Bay Area punk scene of the late 80s and early 90s was honestly, truly something really special. It was centered around all these volunteer-run spaces like the venue 924 Gilman Street, the record store Epicenter, zines like Maximum Rock and Roll and Comet Bus, and distros like Vacuum. It was basically them building their own vision for what the punk scene and community should be from the ground up, brick by brick, without relying on anyone else. And honestly, it was amazing.
You know, I'd go in the morning, on Monday morning, and take all the garbage down at the dump.
I mean, Gilman Street was one of those places where it was run by the kids, just totally ghetto, spray paint, you know.
I grew up in the Seattle area, but I basically worshiped that whole scene from 2 states away. I only made it to Gilman once when I was in high school to go see my favorite band at the time called Spaz, but that whole scene was and is a huge influence on me as a person, and to this day it really defines my vision of what punk means.
People can create their own culture. You don't have to wait. You can say, hey, I got something to say and I'm going to say it.
The point that I want to make here is, make no mistake, Operation Ivy was as punk as it gets, period. They were there from the very beginning of Gilman, and they played with the punkest of punk bands like MDC, Neurosis, Gangrene, Fugazi, you name it. And all of that is really crucial to understanding Rancid.
Punk rock club opened up in my neighborhood. I jumped on a bus the next day and I headed back home.
And after Operation Ivy, Matt and Tim did a few projects together, but nothing that really lasted. And reportedly, Tim was not doing well at the time. As the East Bay Express wrote years later, post-breakup, Tim Armstrong fell into a heavily publicized bout of depression. Dyslexia, poor grades, and low self-esteem left him with no sense of direction without his music. Alcoholism and heroin addiction took control of him, and he wound up living on the streets. Freeman, unwilling to watch his friend kill himself, took in Armstrong and got him sober enough to stay in a halfway house. And while all of this was happening, Tim and Matt started a few projects together, including an early version of Dancehall Crashers, but none of them really stuck until they formed a new band called Rancid and released their first EP in 1992 on Lookout, and then in 1993 their first album on Epitaph.
I know the roof and cave in, over and over again. Beat up blues, a record is broken. A teenage crying again.
I remember this album being really highly anticipated as like Lint and Matt from Operation Ivy's new band, and the album definitely delivered. It was super high energy punk with those trademark Matt Freeman bass lines that still sound amazing, and as good as it was, listening to it now, it just feels like there's something a little bit missing. And that something was Lars Fredrikson, who shortly after that joined on guitar and vocals. And with the classic Rancid lineup in place, they recorded their second album, Let's Go, in just a week, which is pretty crazy considering that it has 23 songs on it, and it came out in 1994. And this is the album that really put them on the map, especially the second single, Salvation, which was their first song to get any kind of traction on mainstream radio. At the time, a lot of people said like, oh, they're just ripping off The Clash, and I can certainly hear those comparisons. But to me, this album was much more in the vein of classic street punk like Blitz or Cockspur. And on the back of their success with Salvation, the album actually cracked the Billboard Top 100. And aside from it just being a great album, I think part of what made that possible was the timing. The grunge band sort of cracked the door open by making alternative rock cool a few years before that, and then Green Day and The Offspring started blowing up, and so all of a sudden the idea of punk bands being on MTV and the radio was suddenly possible.
There was never really an idea that we were going to make it as a band. It wasn't possible because they're just those kinds of bands were not on the radio, they weren't MTV, they weren't making it. So the first thing that even started to change that really has got to be Nirvana and Teen Spirit.
And just like with Operation Ivy, the major labels started calling. They were very eager to find the next Green Day or The Offspring, and they thought Rancid might be that band. One of those was even Madonna's label Maverick, but Rancid ultimately decided to stay with Epitaph and the punk scene.
Lars of Rancid, Madonna. A few years ago, she sent you some nude pictures, didn't she?
Shared it. Well, just one.
Now, what was the reason of her doing that?
She wanted us to sign on to her label.
All of which set the stage for their real breakout moment and Out Come the Wolves in 1995, which in a lot of ways I kind of look at as the album that Operation Ivy might have made if they had stayed together. The big change in this album is that they added ska back to their sound, and it sounded amazing. It's kind of like a more evolved, polished version of Operation Ivy, but without losing any of the edge or energy. Like songs like The 11th Hour, I think could have easily been on Energy, and I immediately loved it.
Do you know where the power lies? And who holds the strength?
And I wasn't the only one who felt that way. The album hit number 45 on Billboard, quickly went gold. They were on magazine covers, they did SNL, they were on MTV's big alternative show called 120 Minutes. Rancid was everywhere.
And this is Lars and Tim from Rancid. And we've got a bunch of questions from our viewers for email. I mean, one of the biggest responses we've ever had for the show.
And they certainly weren't the first punk band to have that kind of success. Like I said, obviously there was Green Day and The Offspring as well, who are both great and definitely legitimate punk bands any way you want to look at it. But to me, at least, neither of those bands just screamed punk rock like Rancid did. This was like full-on Liberty Spikes, bondage pants, and spiked leather jackets punk rock. And I'm not saying that the way a band dresses is the most important thing or anything like that, but if you look, I mean, it's obvious. Rancid looks much more like The Exploited than Nirvana or anything else that was cool at the time. And I do think that matters in the sense that it exposed a lot of kids to this sort of lifestyle that otherwise they probably never would have seen or heard about. For example, in the song Avenues and Alleyways, there's the oi 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 gang vocals. And for those who aren't familiar, oi is a specific subgenre of, I guess you could say, like working class punk that I could never, ever, ever in a million years imagine being on MTV or people saying oi on an album that ended up going platinum. And yet Rancid did exactly that. The cover of the album is also a tribute to the classic Minor Threat cover. And so with this album, to me, they proved what a lot of people saw back in 1988, that Operation Ivy's version of punk meets ska had the potential to go way, way beyond the Little Gilman scene. And after spending a few years riding the wave of success that they had with And Out Come the Wolves, they came back with their next album, Life Won't Wait, in 1998. And on this album, Rancid really doubled down on the ska, reggae, and dub influences. For example, collaborating with people like Dr. Israel or on the title track with Buju Banton. Which is what I personally really appreciate about this album. They basically put the whole scene on notice about what a legitimate ska punk album should sound like. And what I mean by that is by 1998, the third wave ska punk craze was in full effect after the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones and No Doubt had blown up, with probably Real Big Fish being the biggest example of what I mean here.
Please welcome Real Big Fish.
And with all due respect to bands like Real Big Fish and Mustard Plug and all that, in my opinion, those bands are not really ska. It's more just like pop punk with horns kind of bolted on. That's kind of like a cartoonish, childish version of the real thing, compared to the earlier bands like, say, The Specials, who also had that sort of crossover appeal with punks, mods, and skinheads. And I have no idea if this was their intent, but with this album, I feel like Rancid basically said, all right, everybody, step aside. This is how it's done. And from a commercial perspective, Life Won't Wait was also a big success, eventually hitting number 35 on Billboard. Shortly after the release of this album, Rancid also moved to Hellcat Records, which was Tim's imprint on Epitaph. And their first release on Hellcat was their self-titled album in 2000, which was kind of a shocking departure for the band. The natural progression for the band would have been to make something more accessible, more mainstream, like maybe try to do some kind of like pop reggae album, but the band did exactly the opposite of that. This album is pretty much like straight up hardcore. Almost like their tribute to Discharge or something, with most of the songs coming in under 2 minutes. Song titles that could have come right off a D-Beat 7-inch, like Dead Bodies and Meteors of War. And cover art that would look right at home on the back of some crust punk's jacket while they're passed out on the sidewalk outside Gilman.
If the police come and swoop the stage, if there's a street crisis and they live.
And from a commercial perspective, as you would probably expect, this wasn't as successful as their previous album. And it's probably my least favorite Rancid album in terms of the one that I would actually choose to listen to. But I do have a ton of respect for the fact that they were willing to do something so just blatantly anti-commercial at this stage in their career. And after the release of the self-titled album, they also did a few side projects. Most notably, Tim did Transplants with Travis Barker from Blink-182, which personally I think was brilliant. It's this really strange original mix of like punk and hip hop with almost like drum and bass kind of percussion. I've really never heard anything else like it, and if you haven't given their albums a listen, I would strongly suggest that you do because I think they're great. Lars also had his own band called Lars Fredrikson and the Bastards, which is like really solid, straightforward street punk. And the 3 original members of Rancid, being Tim, Matt, and Brett, did another side project called Devil's Brigade with Matt Freeman on vocals. It was kind of like a punk psychobilly thing. And after all of that, they came back to Rancid to make their most controversial album yet, Indestructible, in 2003. And the controversy centered around this being what some people saw as their sellout album. First of all, on the musical side of things, it was probably the most polished thing they had done so far.
If I fall back down, you're gonna help me back up again. If I fall back down, you're gonna be my friend.
Which some people took as a sign that they were like pandering to reach this larger audience. And I don't know what was going on in their heads, but that seems pretty unlikely to me, given that 3 years before that, they basically put out a D-Beat album. So it seems to me that Tim's songwriting had just gotten so good that it just naturally sounded like this super catchy, almost kind of pop version of Rancid. But on top of that, for this album, they were also signed to Warner Brothers. Or I guess more accurately, signed a distribution deal with Warner Brothers, but in the eyes of most people, they were on Warner Brothers.
But now you guys have signed to a major label.
We haven't signed anything.
We have some sort of distribution deal, so I was wondering, what nude pictures did you get in the mail that are better than Madonna's nude pictures to make you sign a distribution deal with Sire?
It was the nude pictures of you that you sent me.
So they were now considered a major label band, which these days is not a big deal at all, but back then it kind of was.
If you can sell, 200,000 CDs on a punk label, that's a great living for the band.
And this was also right around the same time that AFI signed to a major label and got a ton of backlash for that, because in the Gilman scene that both of those bands came from, signing to a major label was like the ultimate sin. As Lars himself said a few years earlier, the one good thing about Rancid is that we never signed to a major label. We stayed indie our whole career. We've shown that you don't need some fucking big major label who you'll end up taking it in the ass from eventually to make music. There was also the video for Fall Back Down, which had the Madden brothers from Good Charlotte and Kelly Osbourne in it. Transplants had one of their songs in a shampoo commercial.
Garnier Fructis, the first fortifying shampoo with active fruit concentrate from Garnier.
And so the old school fans thought that Rancid had sold out and gone Hollywood or whatever. And obviously I can't know what was in their heads or why they signed to Warner Brothers, but to me these kind of debates about selling out are just generally kind of dumb, and the fact that they did it is actually at the essence of why I appreciate Rancid so much. Here's how I think about it. If you believe that DIY punk rock is important and you want more people to discover it, which I do, then you should want bands like Rancid, Green Day, and AFI who came from that scene. You should want them on MTV. You should want them on major labels and on the covers of magazines. You should want them in shampoo covers and hanging out with Good Charlotte, because that is exactly what's going to make more people discover punk. Like, we can't just expect every 12-year-old to somehow wander into some legit hole-in-the-wall punk record store and buy a Discharge album, right? That's just not how it works. Personally, I found punk because I saw Suicidal Tendencies on MTV in 1990 and kind of went down the rabbit hole from there, and I'm sure that the same thing happened with Rancid. Some kid who liked Good Charlotte and Blink-182 saw them hanging out with Rancid, and they're like, oh, who's that? If they're friends with Good Charlotte and Blink, they might be cool. And so then they bought a Rancid album and started going down the rabbit hole, and from there they got into GBH and The Exploited. I mean, this is how it works, right? Nobody is born with crust pants on.
So these are my pants that I've been patching and mending since 2007. 98% of the patches are all handmade, and when I say handmade, I mean hand-drawn. I didn't use stencils, and I didn't screen print.
And for the sake of not making this video an hour long, I'm going to skip to the last and, in my opinion, most important question. What is the lasting impact and influence of Rancid? And the reason that I called them underrated in the beginning is that even though everybody knows who Rancid is and can probably sing along to at least a few of their songs, I really don't hear their name come up as much as it should, in my opinion. In the 30 years that they've been together, they have not put out a single bad song, and I would put that trio of Tim, Matt, and Lars up against any punk band of all time in terms of songwriting and performance. They are just that good. But to me, the overall narrative about Rancid that really makes me appreciate them as much as I do is that they're really the only mainstream band that stayed 100% committed to punk. Of course, there's bands like Green Day, AFI, The Offspring, Fall Out Boy, and Rise Against, who are all great bands and all came from like legit DIY punk and hardcore backgrounds. And I'm not taking anything away from any of them, but all those bands kind of drifted away eventually from punk as a sound and oftentimes from the scene, which, to be clear, I have no problem with. I'm not one of these people that thinks you have to like stay punk your whole life or you're a poser or anything like that. But I do appreciate that Rancid is really the one band who never walked away from punk in any way. Their entire catalog, up to and including their most recent album, Tomorrow Never Comes, is punk. Period. The end. They have never done anything other than be a punk band. And even aside from Rancid itself, with Hellcat Records, Tim has put out all kinds of punk bands like GBH and F-, The Business and US Bombs, helping them reach a much larger audience than they probably would have had on a smaller label. Lars has been on tons of smaller oi and street punk compilations. And how many kids bought one of those because they're like, oh, Lars from Rancid is on this, it might be cool. And then that was their introduction to the genre. So ultimately, you can say what you want about them and their music, but you really can't question their commitment to punk. And for me, someone who honestly, basically my entire worldview is largely based on that specific scene that Rancid came from, that late 80s, early 90s Bay Area Gilman scene, I think that is an incredible contribution to the world of alternative music. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Also, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my videos and podcasts early. I do giveaways. There are members-only channels in my Discord that I'm super active in, and there's also a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool to you, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.